In just 5 minutes, a tiny silver crucifix sent shockwaves through the entire first-class cabin at 35,000 feet. Flight attendant Karen asked her to remove it, in the name of policy. But Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice, didn't even stand. Her defiant silence alone was enough to shatter the polished mask of prejudice. Was it a symbol of religion, or a battle-scarred declaration of survival from someone who refused to vanish? When your faith is treated like a threat, will you hide it or let it speak louder than anything you've ever said? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Heathrow Airport, Terminal 5. The hour was early, but the atmosphere was already on edge, like a stretched rubber band 1 second from snapping. Sharp echoes of heels striking polished floors pierced through the white noise of boarding calls and luggage wheels clattering over tile. Amid this chaos, a woman stepped through the sliding glass doors of the first-class queue, her movements precise, her presence unsettlingly calm. Jasmine Crockett. No entourage, no designer logos, just a dark charcoal suit tailored with purpose, and a worn leather briefcase that had clearly seen more courtrooms than fashion shows. Her shoes bore scuffs near the toes, but her posture, head high, spine like a steel rod, spoke of a quiet authority. What caught the light wasn't gold, but silver. A small, unpolished crucifix resting just below her collarbone. The kind passed down through generations, not bought at boutiques. Around her, heads turned, not out of recognition, but confusion. Who walks like that in a place built for rushing? They didn't know. They couldn't have known. This woman once faced down billion-dollar oil corporations in federal court and made them tremble with nothing but a closing argument and the fire in her eyes. She'd stood in churches still stained with the scent of tear gas, comforting mothers who had buried sons too young to be martyrs. She didn't demand attention, but gravity bowed to her anyway. And yet here, in this corridor of polished marble and platinum lounges, no one said her name. No one offered to carry her case. No one saw the war scars behind her silence. They saw only a black woman in modest clothes walking where most assumed she didn't belong. And somewhere behind the check-in desk, a pair of sharp, watchful eyes narrowed. And as she moved forward, the space reacted, not with noise, but with subtle resistance, the kind that comes not from alarms or raised voices, but from narrowed eyes and tightened smiles. Jasmine reached the first-class gate with the same composure she carried into courtrooms. But the moment she stopped at the counter, she was met by it. Karen, mid-50s, posture like a ruler, voice trained to balance politeness with condescension. Her eyes landed on Jasmine not with welcome, but with calculation. She didn't see the Harvard law degree, or the years of pro bono work, or the national headlines. She saw a woman dressed too simply, with no luggage worth stealing, and skin that didn't fit the mold. And then she saw the crucifix, not a flashy symbol, but a silver cross, aged, unpolished, defiantly visible. The kind of necklace that didn't match the champagne and cufflink world Karen was used to guarding. "Boarding pass, please," Karen said too quickly, already preparing for a problem. Jasmine handed it over in silence. Karen's eyes flicked down to the ticket, then back up. Name Jasmine Crockett. Seat 1A. First class. Everything matched. Still, Karen didn't move. Her lips parted slightly as she stared harder at the pass, as if trying to find an invisible smudge. "First class?" she said, more to herself than to Jasmine. Then louder. "Are you traveling alone today?" Her tone was light, but her intent was not. Jasmine nodded once. Karen didn't hand the pass back right away. She glanced again at the crucifix, collarbone it rested on, the quiet strength behind Jasmine's eyes. Her fingers hesitated on the edge of the paper, like she was holding something dangerous. And then came the judgment, thinly veiled. "You must be clergy?" she asked, tilting her head with a mock smile. "Or perhaps someone's guest." The words weren't cruel. They were worse. They were casual. Casual enough to feel practiced. Jasmine didn't respond at first. She held Karen's gaze steady and unbothered, then finally said, voice low but clear, "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." Karen blinked. Jasmine reached for her boarding pass, and as she took it back, she added, "But thank you for the reminder." She stepped past the desk without another glance. She didn't need to prove anything. Her presence was the proof. Behind her, Karen stood stiffly, her eyes still fixed on the crucifix like it was a challenge to her order. And Jasmine walked on, calm and steady, into a space that hadn't been built for her, but one she had every right to enter. The gate had opened, the cross still shone, and she never looked back. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky, engines humming beneath the floor like a restrained storm. Seatbelt signs dimmed. Overhead, lights softened to a warm, muted gold. First class melted into stillness, the kind of curated quiet that felt more like a museum than a cabin. Jasmine didn't recline. She didn't sip the complimentary champagne. She sat upright, book in hand, posture calm but alert. The silver crucifix on her chest gleamed faintly beneath the reading light, small, weathered, unmistakable. It rested right over her heart, not as fashion, but as presence. A fact, a name tag written in faith and history. And from the galley curtain behind her, Karen saw it and stopped. No one else seemed to notice. No heads turned. No complaints whispered to the crew. But for Karen, that cross didn't go unnoticed. It landed like a spark on dry leaves. It didn't matter that it was quiet, that it was still. It was there, visible in a space that prized subtlety above truth. In her training, no one had said, "Monitor jewelry," but they didn't have to. Years of repetition had taught her what elegance should look like. Jasmine's crucifix didn't match the wineless and tailored suits around her. It didn't blend. It refused to. And that to Karen meant control was slipping. Just a little, but enough. In her mind, symbols like that, religious, raw, openly worn, didn't belong in first class. Not because they were dangerous, but because they made people look twice. And in a cabin like this, looking twice was the first crack in the wall. Karen stepped into the aisle like a verdict entering the room, silent but charged. Each step toward seat 1A was deliberate, sharpened by something unspoken but undeniable. Her body moved with grace, but her jaw was tight. Her clipboard had been set down. Her role now wasn't about service. It was about order, control, correction. She wasn't just walking toward a passenger. She was walking toward something she felt needed to be contained. The silver crucifix glinting against Jasmine's chest had become, in her mind, a provocation. It didn't blend. It didn't back down. And worst of all, it didn't ask for permission. She stopped beside Jasmine, leaned in ever so slightly and smiled. A tight, practiced smile that masked pressure beneath polish. "Ma'am," she said, voice low, clipped, too smooth to be friendly. "I need to speak with you privately, just for a moment." Jasmine looked up, calm, silent, still holding her book like it anchored her to the moment. "We ask that passengers in this cabin refrain from displaying overt religious items during the flight," Karen said, the words flowing too quickly, too precisely. "You may not be aware, but large or clearly visible symbols can create discomfort among our premium guests, especially when they're that specific." She gestured toward the crucifix, not touching but close, her fingers hovering like it was something toxic. "We've had passengers in the past express concerns when such items are worn this openly." She didn't pause to gauge Jasmine's reaction. She didn't need to. She was already pressing forward. "We strive to maintain a neutral space," she said, the volume rising just a notch. Sharp now, no longer hidden. "That's what people pay for here. Quiet, clean, uncontroversial, not to be reminded of certain things." Her eyes flicked down to the crucifix again, like it was a fire hazard. "I understand it may be personal, but in this cabin, some boundaries need to be respected." The words landed not like a request, but a reprimand. For a beat, Jasmine said nothing. She closed her book slowly, carefully, not rushed. The motion alone carried weight, like the slow drawing of a breath before a testimony. Then she turned in her seat, fully facing Karen, not with hostility, but with a gaze so steady, so direct, it made the space between them feel suddenly much smaller. The cabin around them seemed to disappear. Nothing else moved. No one else spoke. This isn't a message, Jasmine said, voice calm but cold, each syllable as exacting as a blade. It's what's left of me. Karen's mouth twitched, a reaction she couldn't suppress. This cross, Jasmine continued, never breaking eye contact, was with me in a hospital when my uncle bled out in a hallway because no one believed a black man screaming meant it was urgent. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the air did. It was with me when I laid on the pavement in Mississippi, holding a torn shirt to my own skin to stop the bleeding while people passed me like I was invisible. Her hand rose, slowly, deliberately, and rested gently on the cross. It was here when I stood in court in front of 12 white jurors who didn't care that I was right, who looked at me and saw a statistic. I wore it anyway. There was no shake in her tone, no desperation, only precision. This isn't jewelry, Jasmine said, softer now, but each word still landing with weight. It's survival. It's my right to exist without shrinking. The space between them wasn't wide, but it felt like a battlefield, the kind where no one raised a weapon, but every word had weight. Karen held her ground, stiff in posture, her hands folded in a practiced gesture of control. She had the look of someone clinging to the comfort of rules. Rules that, in her mind, gave her authority without confrontation. Her tone remained calm, but her jaw was tight, and her voice now carried an unmistakable edge. This isn't personal, she repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. We just want to make sure everyone in first class feels comfortable. We have guidelines. We ask passengers to avoid wearing religious symbols that are too overt. Her eyes flicked again to the crucifix, then quickly back to Jasmine's face, as though it hurt to look too long. It's about keeping things neutral, respectful, for everyone. Jasmine didn't move. Her body remained still, but there was a current in her silence, alive, steady, electric. She stared at Karen long enough for the flight attendant's shoulders to shift slightly under the pressure of it. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice was low, clear, and stripped of anything that could be misread as anger. You keep using the word neutral, she said quietly, but it only ever seems to mean invisible. Karen opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but Jasmine held up a hand, gently but firmly. I know this game, she continued, eyes locked on Karen's. You say it's about the cross, but it isn't. You say it's about guidelines, but nobody else is being asked to tuck away who they are. Karen drew in a breath, defensive tension rising in her chest, but Jasmine's words moved faster, cutting through the space like cold air. This isn't about comfort, Jasmine said. It's about control, about reminding me that this seat, she tapped the armrest gently, wasn't made for someone like me, about making sure I know I'm being watched. Karen swallowed hard. You're misunderstanding my intent. No, Jasmine said without raising her voice. I'm seeing it clearly. There was no drama in her tone, no flare of outrage, just something deeper. Something that spoke of years spent explaining herself in rooms that pretended to be polite while quietly deciding she didn't belong. Her fingers brushed over the crucifix again, not for show, but as if reminding herself that it was still there, still hers. If a white man were wearing this exact same cross, you wouldn't be here, Jasmine said evenly. You wouldn't say a word, and you know that. Karen opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. This cross isn't flashy, not political. It's just mine, Jasmine continued. I don't wear it to provoke anyone. I wear it because it's been with me through every moment they said I wouldn't survive. When I sat in an emergency room holding my cousin's hand while they ignored us for hours. When I lay bleeding by the side of a highway in Mississippi with no one stopping. When I stood in a courtroom full of people who had already decided I was wrong before I spoke. Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was something tightening behind it. Not emotion, not yet, but truth pulling back the curtain. I wore it then, I wear it now, and I will wear it tomorrow. Karen's shoulders stiffened again, but this time the fight was different. It was no longer about policy or tone or image. It was about the quiet collapse of the illusion that the rule had anything to do with the symbol at all. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, not in retreat, but in declaration. You're not uncomfortable with the cross, she said. You're uncomfortable with me wearing it. The words dropped into the space between them like a weight neither of them could move. The silence that followed Jasmine's words wasn't empty. It was full, thick with recognition, with tension, with something unspoken that everyone suddenly felt, but no one dared name. Karen stood frozen, her mouth half open, her posture faltering just enough to reveal the tremor beneath her polished surface. She had come expecting compliance. She'd expected quiet discomfort, a polite nod, maybe even retreat. She hadn't expected truth, raw, composed, and immovable, delivered like testimony in a courtroom she no longer controlled. And then, a new voice entered the room. It came from the seat across the aisle. Low, steady, aged by time but unshaken in its clarity. The kind of voice that didn't ask to be heard, but made itself heard simply by existing. "I've worn a crucifix every day since 1972, the man said, his voice carrying through the quiet like a slow drumbeat. "No one's ever said a damn word about it." Karen turned startled, as if someone had broken rank. Jasmine didn't move, didn't look away. The man leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He was older, mid-70s, his hands rough, his jacket neat but worn at the elbows. His hair was cut military short, white with age. And around his neck, partly visible beneath the collar of his shirt, was a silver cross, slightly larger than Jasmine's, shining with the kind of wear that told stories without a single word spoken. "But I'm not black," he added, eyes fixed on Karen. "So I guess that's the difference." The air shifted, sharply, instantly. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they cut through the illusion that had been holding the scene together. That this was about policy, that this was about protocol, that this was about anything but what it truly was, the discomfort of power when faced with presence. Karen stiffened. Her face flushed in real time. Not bright red. She was too well trained for that. But a thin, unmistakable line of color crawled along her cheekbones. She opened her mouth to speak, but the cabin was no longer listening to her. Jasmine turned her head slowly toward the man. Their eyes met. She gave a single nod. Not of gratitude, but of acknowledgement. Like two veterans passing in the same trench. More motion, subtle but growing. Across the aisle, a woman in business attire gently lowered her tablet and reached slowly for her phone. A passenger 2 rows behind leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust his overhead vent, but his phone camera was already recording. The glow from the screen lit his face in blue. The moment was changing shape, becoming something else. Not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. Karen felt it. The shift, the control she had counted on, the quiet compliance, the invisible authority, was slipping. Not with confrontation, but with exposure. She could feel it in the way no one spoke, in the sudden stillness of her crew standing further back in the galley, uncertain now, waiting, watching. This was no longer a service issue. It was a moment, and she no longer owned it. Her throat tightened. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than she intended, but clipped. "Sir, this isn't a matter of race." The man held up a hand, gently but firmly, and shook his head. "It always is," he said, "when you pretend it's not." Then he sat back, unbothered, arms folded, his cross now visible in full view, as if daring her to say something about it. Karen stood frozen. She could feel every eye on her now, not openly, not accusing, but aware. And that was worse. Judgment could be deflected, outrage could be defended. But awareness? That was a mirror, and she couldn't look away. Her gaze drifted back to Jasmine, still seated, still silent, still wearing the same silver cross she'd worn when this began. But everything had changed. Not the symbol, not the seat, but the ground beneath them. Because now the cabin wasn't wondering if Jasmine belonged. They were wondering why Karen had made it a question in the first place. Karen stood like someone caught in a spotlight that wasn't supposed to find her. Her back was straight, but her jaw was clenched now. The passengers weren't speaking, but they were watching, and that kind of silence could swallow even the most polished authority whole. Jasmine hadn't moved, not even a millimeter. Mr. Williams sat steady as a monument, his cross still visible, his point already made. But the weight in the air was growing too large for the space, too full of what hadn't been said, too thick with what everyone had just seen. And then from the front of the cabin came a sound more arresting than any voice, the hiss of the cockpit door unlocking. It opened slowly, not in a rush, but like someone who understood timing, someone who entered a room only when absolutely necessary. Captain Douglas stepped out. He moved like a man who had spent his life trusting silence more than noise. 61 years old, tall, solid, deliberate in every motion. His hair was clipped short, silver fading into white at the temples. His face was lined, but his eyes were sharp, blue steel beneath heavy brows. The bars on his shoulders gleamed faintly under the cabin lights, and he wore them the way a soldier wears scars, with familiarity, not pride. The name stitched on his jacket read, De Morales Douglas. For 25 years, he had flown commercial jets. Before that, he flew C-130s over sand and fire during the Gulf War. He'd seen smoke rising over Baghdad. He'd heard prayers said through broken teeth. He had buried comrades with dog tags in one hand and a cross in the other. He knew the weight of belief, and he knew the cost of being stripped of it. His eyes moved once across the cabin, slowly taking in everything. Jasmine, Karen, Mr. William. The other passengers watching, but pretending not to. He didn't speak right away. He just stood. And in that standing, everything else paused. Karen turned toward him, clearing her throat as if that might reset the moment. "Captain," she said carefully, "I was just addressing a concern." He held up a hand, not rude, but not loud, just enough. It was the kind of gesture that didn't invite argument. It ended it. Karen fell silent. Captain Douglas turned his gaze to Jasmine, not to study her, not to judge, just to see. His eyes lowered briefly to the crucifix resting against her chest. His expression didn't change. If anything, it softened. He took a single step closer, not imposing, just enough to close the distance without crowding it. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Not because it lacked strength, but because it didn't need volume. "I've watched good men fall apart when they had nothing left to believe in." The words landed slowly, each one deliberate, like someone laying bricks. "In the desert," he continued, "when the sky turns white and the ground is shaking, and there's no sound but your heartbeat and mortar fire, faith is the only thing left." The cabin was still, not a whisper, not a clink of silverware. He looked at Jasmine, nodding once, not in approval, but in recognition. "If that cross helped you survive something," he said, "you wear it. You keep it right where it is." Jasmine didn't speak. Her eyes didn't blink. But there was something in the set of her shoulders now, an ease, a lowering of a weight she hadn't acknowledged out loud. For the first time since the confrontation began, she wasn't holding the moment alone. Captain Douglas turned slightly, letting his eyes sweep the rest of the cabin, not with challenge, but clarity. Then his voice shifted, and this time it carried, not shouted, but broadcast, unmistakable. "And if someone in this cabin feels uncomfortable because another human being chooses to wear something that gave them hope in hell," he let that question hang in the air, then answered it himself, "then maybe they're not ready to live in the real world." A beat passed. Not one person objected. He nodded once more, just slightly to Jasmine, then turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Calm, steady, like nothing more needed to be said, and for a moment it felt like nothing ever had. The cabin door whispered shut behind her, but the silence in the crew rest area was deafening. Karen didn't walk. She collapsed into the narrow bench tucked beside the emergency gear cabinet, the hum of the aircraft doing nothing to quiet the roar inside her own head. Her breath caught in her chest. She had performed thousands of times, check the jacket, fix the smile, control the tone. But this time, she hadn't performed. Not really. This time she had reacted, and now she felt every inch of it unraveling. The overhead light buzzed faintly above her as she sat in the confined space. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers laced tightly enough to turn her knuckles white. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened metal of the storage drawer. Sharp uniform, tight bun, lipstick perfectly intact. But the eyes were wrong, wide, glassy, distant. Her spine remained straight out of habit, but everything else was coming undone in slow motion. She'd meant to de-escalate, hadn't she? That's what she told herself. That's what she'd tell the crew. But the truth, it was growing louder than the script. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. No messages from crew, no alerts from operations. Just a swarm of notifications pouring in like a breach in a dam. A video, someone had filmed it. She knew even before she pressed play. The thumbnail alone was unmistakable. Her face mid-sentence, her hand gesturing toward Jasmine's crucifix. Her voice played in her own ears a second later. We ask our first-class passengers to kindly avoid displaying strong religious symbols. The words landed differently now, flat, plastic, empty. Her tone, measured, clipped, sounded exactly like what it was. Control masked as courtesy. Authority without humanity. Then came Jasmine's reply. Calm, devastating. This isn't a statement. It's what's left of me. Karen paused the video. She felt heat rise in her neck. But it wasn't just shame. It was exposure. Something primal. A cornered instinct realizing the mirror hadn't just been held up to her. It had been broadcast. Her voice, her expression, her bias. The internet would tear it apart in hours, maybe minutes. The headlines would write themselves. Flight attendant confronts passenger over cross. No context, no backstory. Just the frame, the clip, the echo. And maybe that's all it deserved to be. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she scrolled. Comment after comment. Thousands already. Some in defense, most not. Some were cruel. Some were measured. The worst weren't the insults. The worst were the quiet, disappointed ones. I've worked in hospitality for 19 years. You can hear it in her tone. She didn't attack, but you can feel the judgment bleeding through the smile. She didn't say it, but she said everything. Karen closed her eyes. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was the gatekeeper of order, the one who kept the space neutral, clean, controlled. But now that word, neutral, sounded cowardly, fragile. It wasn't that she had questioned a cross. She had questioned the person wearing it, and that realization hit harder than anything the comment section could throw at her. She remembered her mother's voice, soft, weary from long hours, waiting tables in Atlanta. Kindness isn't just what you say, it's what you choose not to show on your face. Back then, Karen didn't understand it. She thought kindness was in rules and tone. But now, sitting alone in the belly of a jet 30,000 feet in the air, she finally understood. Her failure hadn't been in the policy, it had been in the pause, the glance, the way her voice tightened around a cross worn by the wrong neck. She wanted to disappear, to crawl into a quiet place of excuses, but even her thoughts refused to let her hide. She remembered the way Jasmine looked at her, not angry, not afraid, just solid. Like someone who'd faced worse and didn't need Karen's approval to breathe. And that, perhaps, had been the final trigger. Karen had always equated calm with control, but Jasmine's calm had exposed control, revealed it for what it was, brittle. She leaned back against the wall of the compartment, staring upward now. The ceiling wasn't moving, but she felt motion sickness creeping in, not from turbulence, but from within. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she deserved the uniform on her chest. Not because she had shouted, not because she had broken rules, but because she'd done everything by the book and still done harm. She didn't know what she would say to Jasmine, or if she'd even get the chance. But she knew one thing with painful clarity. Nothing about what had happened could be undone by a revised announcement or a company memo. This wasn't a training error. This was a failure of self-awareness. Outside the curtain, the cabin had returned to its curated hush. Reclined seats, soft jazz, ice clinking into glasses. But Karen sat behind it all, alone in the dark, the voice of a veteran captain still echoing in her mind. If that cross helped you survive something, you wear it. You keep it right where it is. And deeper still, Jasmine's quieter truth. You're not uncomfortable with the cross. You're uncomfortable with me wearing it. The curtain closed behind her with a soft hiss, but the noise in Karen's chest was deafening. Every step back toward the front of the cabin felt like walking through thick wind. The lights were dimmed, the passengers mostly quiet, the illusion of calm restored. But for her, nothing had settled. The cabin hadn't forgotten. She hadn't forgotten. The cross was still there. So was the silence. So was the mirror Jasmine had held up without ever raising her voice. Karen adjusted her collar, not to look presentable, just to feel her hands doing something real. She made her way down the aisle slowly, the overhead bins casting long, narrow shadows that seemed to follow her movement like ghosts. Her shoes tapped against the carpet softly. Soft, but not unnoticed. She could feel it, the flick of eyes from passengers who had seen too much already. Some watched openly, others pretended not to, but all of them knew. Jasmine was still in 1A. She sat exactly as she had before, upright, composed. Her book rested on her lap, closed now, fingers gently folded over it. She didn't shift, didn't lean back or forward, just watched as Karen approached, eyes clear, calm, unreadable. Not cold, just waiting, like someone who'd seen enough apologies to know most were for show. Karen stopped beside her row. She didn't crouch this time, didn't kneel. That wasn't what this moment needed. Instead, she stood tall, but with a weight pressing through her spine that had nothing to do with gravity. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, voice low but clear. "But I needed to say this." Jasmine didn't speak, not yet. Karen took a breath, but didn't look away. "I thought I was following policy," she said, "but the truth is, I was defending my own fear, my own image of what this cabin should look like. And when I saw you and that cross," she hesitated, not for words, for courage. "I didn't see you. I saw what I thought didn't belong, and I acted like it was my job to correct that. But it wasn't. It was my job to serve, with respect, with understanding. I failed at that." Jasmine's gaze didn't soften, but something shifted in the air between them. Karen continued, voice steadier now, not rehearsed, owned. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult you. But what I did hurt anyway, because I made you carry the burden of my discomfort." She swallowed. "And I'm sorry." A long pause followed. Then Jasmine leaned forward. Not much, just enough to close the space slightly. Her voice, when it came, was soft but so clear it seemed to quiet the rest of the cabin by its very presence. "Most people wait until they're caught to say what you just said." Karen flinched slightly. "But you came back." Another beat passed. Jasmine studied her, not with suspicion, but with practiced discernment, like someone who'd been offered empty apologies one too many times. "I don't need you to fall apart," she said. "I just need you to be better after this." Karen nodded once. It wasn't reflex. It was a promise she didn't know how to prove yet, but needed to. Jasmine looked down at the crucifix, gently touching her collarbone, then back up at Karen. "This isn't a weapon," she said. "It's a memory, and a shield." Karen's eyes welled slightly, not enough to cry, just enough to sting. "I see that now," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't before, but I do now." Jasmine gave a single measured nod. "I believe you." Nothing more, nothing less. And that was all that needed to be said. Karen stood there a second longer, not frozen, just human. Then she turned slowly, walking back down the aisle, not as the flight attendant reclaiming control, but as a woman who had finally let go of it. Behind her, Jasmine sat quietly in her seat. The crucifix stayed exactly where it had been from the start, and now no one dared to ask her to move it again. 1 month had passed, but the echo of that flight still lived in Jasmine's chest. Now as she stood in the wings of a TEDx stage beneath a bold red banner reading, "The Right to Presence," that moment, 35,000 feet in the air, a silver crucifix, a steady voice in a shifting room, was not behind her. It was within her. The auditorium lights were low, the air thick with the silence of attention. Dozens of rows of faces waited, eyes lifted, ready for something they didn't know they needed. Jasmine stepped forward. She didn't stride. She didn't command. She simply moved like she always had, calm, grounded, unafraid. A small microphone curved across her cheek. The crucifix still hung below her collarbone, silent, radiant. She stepped into the light, and the room leaned in. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but firm enough to silence doubt. A month ago, she began, I was asked to hide something I've worn since I was 17. No dramatic pause, just truth. Not because it was dangerous, not because it was against any rule, but because it made someone uncomfortable. A hush washed across the crowd, the kind of stillness that signals people are truly listening. It wasn't the symbol, she said. It was me. She let that land. What I wore was mistaken for defiance. What I carried was mistaken for threat. But what I was doing, what I've always done, and was survive. She looked up, locking eyes with no one and everyone. And I've learned that silence in the face of that kind of injustice is not neutrality. It's complicity. The audience didn't erupt. It held. The words weren't built for applause. They were built for truth. Jasmine took a step forward, not in performance, but in presence. When someone is asked to shrink so that others don't have to stretch, she continued, we are not maintaining peace. We are protecting power. A low breath moved through the crowd like a wave. I'm not here to shame anyone, she said, her tone still even, still composed. I'm here to tell you that we do not need to make ourselves smaller to be allowed into the room. She turned slightly, eyes scanning the people watching her. Corporate leaders, educators, students, strangers. Because presence is not a privilege, it's a birthright. The words rang clear and final. And every time we pretend not to see injustice, just to keep the room quiet, we're saying that comfort matters more than truth. Silence, then breath, then thunder. The applause began not with a roar, but with a single clap that multiplied. A wave of hands, not for performance, but for resonance. People stood. Some wiped tears. Some held them in. Jasmine remained still, her body calm even as the crowd rose. She didn't bow. She didn't smile wide. She simply nodded once, with the quiet strength of someone who had finally said out loud what generations before her had only dared to think. The event moved on, as events do. New speakers, new stories. But the air in the room had changed. Afterward, in the backstage lounge where attendees mingled, thanked, asked for photos or signed programs, Jasmine stood near a small table with a glass of water in her hand, quietly absorbing the room again. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't trying to be. She was just present, fully, unapologetically. That was enough. Then she saw her, across the room, dressed not in uniform but in a simple navy blazer and slacks, stood Karen. Hair down, no clipboard, no performance. She stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, hesitant at the edges of the space. A woman debating whether she deserved to walk through it. Their eyes met. Karen stepped forward slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't rehearse. She looked like someone who had carried 30 days of reckoning on her back and wasn't sure how to put it down. She stopped a few feet away. No crowd, no phones, just the two of them. Karen took a shallow breath. You showed me something, she said quietly. Something I didn't know I was hiding behind. Jasmine said nothing, waiting. Karen's voice didn't tremble, but it didn't pretend to be strong either. Sometimes rules, she began, then paused as if finding the real shape of the thought. Sometimes rules are just a shell we put around our fear, and we call it professionalism, or policy, or safety. She met Jasmine's gaze, not trying to earn anything, just trying to be honest. But really, I think I was just scared of being wrong, of what I didn't understand. She stopped there. That was all she had. Jasmine's expression didn't shift right away. But then slowly, she smiled. Not the kind that forgave, the kind that understood. If you're still carrying that fear, she said, voice gentle but resolute, don't hide it. A pause, then the softest lift of her chin. Walk through it. Karen nodded once, and something in her shoulders lowered, like a weight shifting from shame into something else. Not relief, not closure, but beginning. Jasmine turned back to the room, her glass still in hand. The light from the TEDx letters behind her painted a soft glow across her shoulders. The conversation was over, but its echo would last far beyond the walls of that stage. Because in that moment, two women had chosen presence over perfection, and somewhere in the crowd, someone else now believed they could do the same. Karen had always loved the silence of a pre-flight cabin, the hum of powered systems, the low thrum of oxygen recycling through filtered vents, the muted shuffle of early boarders. But the silence she stepped into now, her first flight back, wasn't comforting. It was conscious, and she carried it like a second skin. It had been 6 weeks since the flight that changed her. 6 weeks since she'd spoken words she thought were policy, but learned were judgment. 6 weeks since her reflection had stopped looking like someone who simply followed rules and started looking like someone who used them to hide fear. The airline hadn't suspended her. Officially, it was time for internal reflection, but she knew what it was: a pause, a reckoning, a quiet, necessary exile. Now she was back. The uniform still fit, the scarf still wrapped neatly at her collar, the wings still pinned above her heart. But everything beneath had shifted. Her posture was humbler, not bent, just quieter. She walked the jet bridge like someone entering a familiar place with unfamiliar eyes. And for the first time in her career, she didn't walk in like she owned the aisle. She walked in like she respected it. Pre-boarding passed without incident. She smiled at a young father carrying a sleeping toddler. She knelt beside an older woman who needed help with her belt clasp, asking gently, "Is that too tight?" A question she'd never asked before. And when a man stepped into first class with a Sikh turban, briefcase in one hand, and a soft gold khanda around his neck, Karen's gaze met his, not with curiosity, but with warmth. Not performance. Practice. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, voice calm. "Please let me know if you need anything at all." He nodded, and for a moment, the world didn't shift. But Karen did. She returned to the galley with no fanfare, pouring drinks and running final safety checks. But every task carried intention. Not mechanical efficiency, human weight. She remembered every face that had gone unnoticed before, every detail she used to miss. Halfway through the flight, she stood quietly near row 4, assisting with a service request when a young woman, no older than 20, stopped her mid-sentence. She wore a soft green hijab, the corners tucked neatly behind her ears, and a name tag from a college lanyard that read, "Engineering Student, Georgia Tech. "I just wanted to say," the girl said, her voice almost a whisper, "I saw that video." Karen blinked. "You were in it, right? With Ms. Crockett?" Karen hesitated, then nodded. The girl smiled, small and sincere. "I thought it would be ugly, but it wasn't. It was honest. Thank you for coming back from that." Karen exhaled slowly. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice lower than she expected. "I've learned that fixing something doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's just doing better. Every single day." The girl nodded. "Well, you are." Karen smiled gently, then stepped back toward the galley. She didn't cry, but her chest ached in the way it does when a burden shifts. Not gone, just no longer carried alone. That night, she filled out her post-flight report. She listed the usual notes: turbulence moderate, service smooth, one child with an allergy to peanuts. But then, in the open comments section, she added something she'd never written before. Cabin energy respectful. Passengers diverse. Everyone showed up. So did I. And she meant every word. Karen didn't change the world that day, but she returned to it, and she chose to walk through it differently. Every day forward. Every aisle walked, every seat approached, every assumption paused before it formed, would be part of her new way of flying. Not to escape altitude, but to find perspective. It was early morning, not yet dawn. The city was still cloaked in that pale blue silence that comes before the world wakes. Jasmine sat by the window of her modest apartment, barefoot, a half-drunk cup of tea cooling beside her on the table. The light was low, not dim from lack of power, but deliberate. The kind of light you sit in when you don't want to be distracted by anything other than your own thoughts. The crucifix still hung around her neck. It was lighter now, not physically, but spiritually. For the first time in years, it no longer felt like a burden disguised as protection. It felt like presence, like memory, like something that had been witnessed, finally, for what it truly was. She opened her journal, not the one she used for work, the leather one, the one with dog-eared pages and water stains from too many flights, too many cities, the one she didn't carry into courtrooms or interviews, but always kept in her suitcase anyway. She turned to a fresh page, dated it quietly, no drama, just truth, and began to write. Not to anyone, not to the world, just to the silence. Some moments never leave you, not because they were traumatic or loud or devastating, but because they revealed something so true you could never unsee it. On that flight, I wasn't afraid. Not really. I was tired. Tired of being asked to explain, to soften, to excuse my right to be whole in a space designed to question it. I've stood before juries. I've walked through courthouses where my heels echoed like threats. I've held mothers whose sons didn't get the chance to grow into men. I've buried my voice in policy, in professionalism, in patience. But that moment, that small, quiet, barely confrontational moment, it cracked something open. Not rage, recognition of how easily power dresses itself in politeness, of how deeply we've all been trained to accept it. She paused, tapping the pen against the table once, then continued. Karen wasn't a villain. She was just early in the work. And I could see it, the flicker in her eye when control stopped working, the look of someone watching a mask slip off their own face. I didn't forgive her in the moment because I'm saintly. I forgave her because I remembered. I remembered when I used to think power was the loudest voice, when I thought making people comfortable meant I was doing well. She didn't harm me with malice. She harmed me with assumption, but she came back, and that, maybe more than anything, was the real beginning. Outside the window, the city started to stretch. A few cars hummed past, a jogger in a neon vest. The sky softened from navy to silver. Jasmine set the pen down. She didn't sign the page. She didn't need to. It wasn't a letter meant to be mailed or framed or even shared. It was a letter of witness to the moment, to the scar, to the survival. She folded the page gently, slipped it into the inner pocket of her journal, next to a faded photograph of her mother and a sermon note written on the back of a napkin. Then she closed the book. She sat still for a moment longer, one hand resting over the journal, the other at her collar, thumb brushing lightly over the edge of the cross. She wasn't preparing for a speech. She wasn't gearing up for a fight. She was simply being present, with herself, with her truth, with the quiet, small act of remembering and not flinching. That morning, she didn't post a quote online. She didn't write a new piece. She didn't respond to the latest comment about the video. Instead, she brewed a fresh cup of tea. She watered her plant. And when she left the apartment, the crucifix still hung where it always had, above her heart, quiet but visible. Not to provoke, not to perform, just to say, I'm still here. As Jasmine gently closed the worn leather journal, a quiet yet profound silence filled the room, one that invited reflection. Outside, the morning city hummed steadily to life, oblivious to the weight of Jasmine's quiet revelations. Yet within these four walls, her truths vibrated powerfully, echoing lessons far greater than her own story. This was no longer just about Jasmine and Karen or a single flight. It was about something deeper, more universal, the unspoken complicity of silence, the quiet oppression of conformity, and the strength it took to defy both. Her experiences had become symbolic, a lens through which countless others could finally see themselves. This moment was not an end, but a beginning, a turning point, inviting those who watched, listened, and understood to step beyond fear and into authenticity. In the aftermath of Jasmine's TEDx talk, the conversation ignited by that 20-second video became unstoppable. People who had once accepted discrimination quietly began speaking up, recognizing their own silence as a kind of consent. Social media posts transitioned into living room dialogues. Uncomfortable truths were now openly discussed at kitchen tables, workplaces, and in classrooms. Teachers, nurses, executives, ordinary individuals who had once chosen neutrality suddenly felt compelled to stand firmly beside those who were marginalized. Jasmine's words had illuminated an uncomfortable yet essential truth. Neutrality in the face of injustice was simply injustice disguised as politeness. The message had transcended Jasmine herself, becoming an urgent reminder of society's collective responsibility. The cross she wore, symbolic of her own survival and resilience, had become a universal emblem of courage, authenticity, and strength in vulnerability. Meanwhile, Karen's journey was equally profound, though quieter. Back at work, every interaction was now infused with mindfulness and genuine care. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor a performance meant for redemption. It was something deeper, an awakening. Karen no longer saw policy as a rigid wall, but as a guideline subject to empathy, context, and compassion. She finally understood that behind every guideline, behind every rule, were real lives, real emotions, and very real fears. Her interactions became meaningful exchanges instead of scripted transactions. And though she knew she could never fully erase the damage she had once inadvertently caused, she now saw clearly how to contribute meaningfully to its healing. Every small gesture of kindness, every gentle acknowledgement of someone's dignity, became her quiet rebellion against the fear she had once harbored. Yet the greatest lesson transcended both Jasmine and Karen. It belonged to the world watching them. It was about the invisible barriers built by assumptions, about how easily silence can become a prison. The injustice Jasmine faced wasn't overtly violent, but quietly pervasive, wrapped neatly in politeness, hidden beneath layers of subtle expectation. This subtlety was its most dangerous feature. Discrimination that doesn't shout rarely faces confrontation. Jasmine's gentle refusal to conform had forced everyone watching to question the hidden prejudices they carried. Her calm confrontation and Karen's subsequent awakening had exposed the fragile, uncomfortable truth that societal biases live silently within us all. Jasmine's courage reminded us that confronting injustice doesn't always require anger or outrage. Often it simply requires unwavering presence. Through Jasmine's courage and Karen's introspection, the story revealed the critical importance of listening deeply and speaking honestly. Real conversations, uncomfortable, honest, and transparent, were now being had. From boardrooms to churches, people began acknowledging their own complicity, understanding that silence was not safety, but an endorsement of oppression. Jasmine had shown clearly that sometimes presence alone could be revolutionary. Showing up authentically, visibly, without apology, wasn't simply an act of personal liberation. It was an invitation for others to step bravely into their own truth. The lesson was stark yet hopeful. Humanity thrives not in uniformity, but in the acknowledgement and celebration of difference. But the story did not promise easy redemption or instant change. It emphasized that genuine transformation requires continuous, conscious effort. Karen's return to the skies wasn't marked by grand gestures, but by quiet, consistent commitment. Jasmine's continued advocacy wasn't about spotlight or accolades. It was about planting seeds of consciousness wherever she went. They both understood deeply now that creating a just, compassionate world is never finished. It is ongoing work. It requires humility, accountability, and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. These women had faced a difficult truth head-on, and in doing so, illuminated a path forward for countless others, still trapped behind silence, prejudice, or fear. For those who followed their story online, on television, or through whispered retellings at work and home, it became a symbol of hope and possibility. It illustrated how change often begins quietly, with a single moment of refusal to accept the unacceptable. Jasmine's refusal wasn't loud, aggressive, or confrontational. It was simply firm. Karen's subsequent reckoning wasn't dramatic or performative. It was genuine, deeply reflective, and painfully honest. Together, they demonstrated how transformative even a single moment of sincere, courageous humanity could be. The message spread rapidly, crossing borders, cultures, and generations, reminding millions that standing up against injustice doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means simply refusing to sit silently when someone is asked unfairly to disappear. At its core, this was a story of human dignity. Jasmine didn't demand special treatment, recognition, or praise. She asked only for respect, authenticity, and the freedom to exist unapologetically as herself. Karen learned through painful self-reflection that dignity is not granted but inherently deserved by everyone. The clash between these two women, brief and uncomfortable though it had been, had sparked a powerful global conversation about belonging, empathy, and accountability. It taught that discrimination often arrives disguised in manners and protocol, but is always recognizable by its fundamental refusal to acknowledge someone's humanity fully. As weeks passed, Jasmine began receiving letters from around the world. She kept them safely, reading each one carefully, feeling humbled by how deeply her words had resonated. Letters came from places she had never visited, from villages in India, schools in Nigeria, small towns in the American Midwest. They all said variations of the same thing. Her courage had given them language, had given them strength. One letter from a young man in rural Tennessee simply read, "You made me brave enough to show my true self to my family. Thank you for making me realize my existence matters." Jasmine understood fully then that this story had grown far beyond herself, becoming an anthem for those still fighting unseen battles. In Karen's world, the quiet changes continued daily. She'd become known for gentle bravery, standing up subtly yet firmly in meetings, during flights, in quiet conversations with colleagues. Once, when another flight attendant hesitated over letting a passenger board while wearing a prominent religious symbol, Karen stepped forward and softly said, "It's okay. It matters to her. It doesn't harm anyone else." Her colleague nodded slowly, understanding. Karen realized that each day was a series of small decisions, each moment an opportunity to choose understanding over fear. As their story continued to inspire others, both Jasmine and Karen understood a deeper, shared truth. Humanity's most profound growth often arises from discomfort. Painful conversations, quiet courage, sincere reflection, all were necessary ingredients for meaningful change. They had both witnessed firsthand that staying silent in moments of injustice was never neutrality, but rather an endorsement of harm. Their experiences taught the world that courage is rarely loud or dramatic. Often it's quiet, steady, persistent, and brave enough to stand alone. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from their journey was the simplest yet the hardest to embody. True humanity requires seeing others fully and clearly, without expectation or judgment. It means choosing empathy even when it's easier to remain comfortably indifferent. Jasmine and Karen's intertwined stories illuminated a universal truth, that each of us holds the power to either perpetuate injustice through silence or dismantle it through brave, authentic presence. Their message was now clear, echoing in every heart touched by their story. Presence, dignity, and authenticity are not negotiable rights reserved for a few. They are human rights owed to everyone. For those who followed their story online, on television, or through whispered retellings at work and home, it became a symbol of hope and possibility. It illustrated how change often begins quietly, with a single moment of refusal to accept the unacceptable. Jasmine's refusal wasn't loud, aggressive, or confrontational. It was simply firm. Karen's subsequent reckoning wasn't dramatic or performative. It was genuine, deeply reflective, and painfully honest. Together, they demonstrated how transformative even a single moment of sincere, courageous humanity could be. The message spread rapidly, crossing borders, cultures, and generations, reminding millions that standing up against injustice doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means simply refusing to sit silently when someone is asked unfairly to disappear. At its core, this was a story of human dignity. Jasmine didn't demand special treatment, recognition, or praise. She asked only for respect, authenticity, and the freedom to exist unapologetically as herself. Karen learned through painful self-reflection that dignity is not granted, but inherently deserved by everyone. The clash between these two women, brief and uncomfortable though it had been, had sparked a powerful global conversation about belonging, empathy, and accountability. It taught that discrimination often arrives disguised in manners and protocol, but is always recognizable by its fundamental refusal to acknowledge someone's humanity fully. As weeks passed, Jasmine began receiving letters from around the world. She kept them safely, reading each one carefully, feeling humbled by how deeply her words had resonated. Letters came from places she had never visited, from villages in India, schools in Nigeria, small towns in the American Midwest. They all said variations of the same thing. Her courage had given them language, had given them strength. One letter from a young man in rural Tennessee simply read, "You made me brave enough to show my true self to my family. Thank you for making me realize my existence matters." Jasmine understood fully then that this story had grown far beyond herself, becoming an anthem for those still fighting unseen battles. In Karen's world, the quiet changes continued daily. She'd become known for gentle bravery, standing up subtly yet firmly in meetings, during flights, in quiet conversations with colleagues. Once, when another flight attendant hesitated over letting a passenger board while wearing a prominent religious symbol, Karen stepped forward and softly said, "It's okay. It matters to her. It doesn't harm anyone else." Her colleague nodded slowly, understanding. Karen realized that each day was a series of small decisions, each moment an opportunity to choose understanding over fear. As their story continued to inspire others, both Jasmine and Karen understood a deeper, shared truth. Humanity's most profound growth often arises from discomfort. Painful conversations, quiet courage, sincere reflection, all were necessary ingredients for meaningful change. They had both witnessed firsthand that staying silent in moments of injustice was never neutrality, but rather an endorsement of harm. Their experiences taught the world that courage is rarely loud or dramatic. Often it's quiet, steady, persistent, and brave enough to stand alone. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from their journey was the simplest, yet the hardest to embody. True humanity requires seeing others fully and clearly, without expectation or judgment. It means choosing empathy even when it's easier to remain comfortably indifferent. Jasmine and Karen's intertwined stories illuminated a universal truth, that each of us holds the power to either perpetuate injustice through silence or dismantle it through brave, authentic presence. Their message was now clear, echoing in every heart touched by their story. Presence, dignity, and authenticity are not negotiable rights reserved for a few. They are human rights owed to everyone.